Hollywood has been lying to you about samurai for decades, and the worst part? Most people still believe these myths are actually true. Look, I get it. We all grew up watching those epic samurai movies where warriors followed some unbreakable honor code and never questioned their masters. The problem is, almost none of that stuff actually happened the way you think it did. Today we're going to break down the biggest samurai myths that Hollywood keeps pushing. And trust me, the real history is way more interesting than the movies. Let's get into it. So here's the thing. When you think about samurai, what comes to mind? Probably some warrior in pristine armor, standing on a hillside at sunset, ready to die for honor at any moment, right? Maybe you're picturing them meditating before battle, or refusing to use dishonorable weapons, or following bushido like it's some kind of ancient Bible that every samurai memorized. The problem is that Hollywood took bits and pieces of samurai culture, mixed them with a bunch of romantic ideas, and created this image that's more fantasy than fact. And it's not just one or two small details they got wrong. We're talking about fundamental misunderstandings about who the samurai actually were, what they actually believed, and how they actually lived. The real samurai were way more complex, and honestly, way more human than the movies show. They weren't these perfect warriors who lived and breathed honor every single second. They were people who sometimes broke rules, who adapted to survive, who cared about money and status, and who definitely didn't always choose death over dishonor like the movies suggest. And here's why this matters. These myths don't just make for inaccurate movies, they've actually shaped how we think about Japanese history and culture. People walk away from these films thinking they understand samurai, but really, they're just understanding a Hollywood version that was created to sell tickets. So let's fix that today. Let's start with probably the biggest myth of them all. The idea that samurai followed this strict code called bushido, and that this code existed for thousands of years, guiding every samurai's actions from the beginning of samurai culture. Here's the truth. Bushido, as we know it today, was basically invented in the early 1900s. I'm not saying samurai didn't have any codes or values. They definitely did. But this unified written-down code that every samurai followed, that's not real. What actually happened is that different samurai clans had different values and different rules. Some samurai valued loyalty above everything. Others were way more practical and would switch sides if it meant survival or better opportunities. The word bushido itself means the way of the warrior. But it wasn't really used the way we use it now until around the Meiji period, which started in 1868. A guy named Nitobe Inazo wrote a book in 1900 called Bushido, the Soul of Japan, and he basically took various samurai values and packaged them into this neat code. But here's the kicker. He wrote it in English for a Western audience, and he was trying to explain Japanese culture to people who knew nothing about it. So he simplified everything and made it sound way more unified and organized than it ever actually was. Real samurai had to make tough choices all the time, and honor wasn't always the deciding factor. Sometimes they chose survival, sometimes they chose money, sometimes they betrayed their lords because, well, politics in feudal Japan were complicated and messy. The idea that every samurai would rather die than face dishonor is just not how things worked in reality. Now let's talk about seppuku, which is ritual suicide. Hollywood loves this one. In the movies, samurai are constantly offering to commit seppuku for the smallest mistakes, like it's just a normal Tuesday afternoon activity. The truth? Seppuku was relatively rare, and it definitely wasn't something samurai did casually. Yes, seppuku was a real practice, but it was usually reserved for serious situations. Maybe a samurai had committed a major crime, or maybe they had brought serious shame to their family or lord. It was also sometimes used as a way to protest an unjust decision or to take responsibility for a massive failure. But the key word here is serious. Samurai weren't just offing themselves left and right because they made a small mistake in battle or said something awkward at dinner. Also, the whole process was way more complicated than movies show. There was usually a formal ceremony involved, with witnesses, and often another samurai would be there to quickly cut off the person's head to end their suffering. It wasn't this romantic, peaceful moment that Hollywood portrays. It was brutal and painful, and most samurai probably wanted to avoid it if they could. Here's another big one. The idea that samurai only used swords, and that using other weapons was somehow beneath them or dishonorable. This myth is everywhere in movies. You always see samurai with their katanas, treating their swords like sacred objects and refusing to use anything else. Reality check. Samurai used whatever weapons made sense for the situation. In fact, for a huge chunk of samurai history, their main weapon wasn't even the sword. It was the bow and arrow. Samurai were skilled archers, and being good with a bow was actually more important than being good with a sword for a long time. They also used spears, they used early guns once those were introduced to Japan, and they definitely weren't above using whatever gave them an advantage in battle. The katana did become an important symbol of samurai status, especially during peacetime, but thinking of samurai as sword guys is like thinking of modern soldiers as rifle guys and ignoring all the other equipment and weapons they use. It's just one part of a much bigger picture. And speaking of swords, let's tackle the myth that katanas were these magical super weapons that could cut through anything. Look, katanas were good swords. Japanese swordmakers were incredibly skilled, and they created weapons that were sharp, durable, and beautiful. But Hollywood has turned them into lightsabers, basically. In movies, you see katanas cutting through armor, cutting through other swords, cutting through basically anything like it's butter. That's not real. Katanas had limitations just like any other sword. They could chip, they could break, and they definitely couldn't cut through solid metal armor like it was paper. Samurai armor was specifically designed to protect against sword strikes, and it did a pretty good job of that. Also, the whole idea that katanas were folded thousands of times and that this made them superior to all other swords, that's exaggerated too. Yes, Japanese smiths used a folding technique, but they did this because the iron ore in Japan had a lot of impurities. Folding the metal helped remove those impurities and create a better blade. European smiths didn't need to do this as much because they had access to better quality iron. It wasn't that Japanese swords were magically better. They were just made differently because of the available resources. Let's move on to another huge myth, the idea that samurai were always these noble, honorable warriors who protected the weak and fought for justice. This is probably the most damaging myth because it paints samurai as basically medieval superheroes. Here's what samurai actually were. They were the military nobility of feudal Japan. They were warriors, yes, but they were also landlords, tax collectors, and enforcers for their lords. Some samurai were great people who genuinely tried to do right by others, but many samurai were just doing their jobs, which often included some pretty harsh stuff. They collected taxes from peasants, sometimes brutally. They enforced their lord's will, even when that meant doing things that weren't exactly honorable. And they definitely had a lot of social privileges that came at the expense of lower classes. There was even a practice called crossroads killing, or tsujigiri, where some samurai would test out their new swords on random peasants or travelers. Now, this wasn't super common, and it was technically illegal, but the fact that it happened at all shows you that not every samurai was a noble protector of the innocent. The relationship between samurai and peasants wasn't this friendly, protective thing that movies show. It was a class-based hierarchy where samurai had power and peasants didn't. Sure, some samurai treated people fairly, but many others abused their power because they could get away with it. Here's another one that bugs me. The myth that samurai were all men and that female warriors weren't a thing in feudal Japan. Hollywood has really dropped the ball on this one because female samurai absolutely existed. They were called honor bugeisha, and they were trained in combat just like male samurai. These women fought in battles, defended their homes, and some of them became legendary warriors. There's Tomoe Gozen, who fought in the Genpei War and was described as a fearsome warrior who was worth 1,000 regular soldiers. There's Nakano Takeko, who fought in the Boshin War and led a unit of female warriors. These weren't rare exceptions. Many samurai families trained their daughters in combat, especially in the use of the naginata, which was a kind of polearm. But when you watch most samurai movies, where are these women? Usually nowhere to be found, or if they are there, they're just wives or daughters who don't fight. Hollywood has basically erased this entire aspect of samurai history, which is a shame because these women's stories are incredible. Now let's talk about loyalty, because this is another big one. Movies love to show samurai as being absolutely, unquestionably loyal to their lords no matter what. The famous story of the 47 Ronin gets brought up a lot as the ultimate example of samurai loyalty. But here's the thing. The 47 Ronin story is famous precisely because it was unusual. If samurai switching sides and breaking loyalty was rare, this story wouldn't be such a big deal. The reality is that samurai switched allegiances all the time, especially during the Sengoku period, which was basically a 100-year period of constant warfare, where different clans were fighting for control of Japan. During this time, samurai would look at which side was winning, which lord offered better benefits, and make strategic decisions about who to serve. This wasn't seen as shameful or dishonorable, it was just practical politics. The idea that a samurai would serve one lord for their entire life and never question anything was more of an ideal than a reality, and even then, it was an ideal that got emphasized more during peacetime than during actual wars. Let's also bust the myth that all samurai were these stoic, emotionless warriors who never showed fear or doubt. This image comes partly from Zen Buddhism and the idea that samurai were supposed to be in perfect mental control at all times. But again, samurai were human beings with human emotions. Historical records show samurai writing poetry about their fears before battle. They wrote letters to their families expressing doubt and worry. They felt all the normal human emotions that anyone would feel when facing death or difficult decisions. The difference is that they were trained to act despite those fears, not that they never felt fear in the first place. This myth also ignores the fact that many samurai had rich emotional lives outside of warfare. They wrote poetry, they practiced tea ceremony, they created art, they fell in love, they had families. Reducing them to emotionless killing machines does a huge disservice to who they actually were as complete human beings. Here's another misconception, that samurai culture was completely separate from the rest of Japanese society, and that samurai lived in this isolated warrior world. The truth is that samurai were deeply integrated into Japanese society. They weren't just fighters, they were administrators, they were cultural leaders, they were patrons of the arts. During the long peace of the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, most samurai weren't even fighting. They were bureaucrats, essentially. They managed territories, they kept records, they settled disputes. Many samurai became scholars, teachers, or artists during this time. The idea of the samurai as purely a warrior class only really applied during times of war, and Japan had long periods of peace where being a samurai meant something very different. And finally, let's talk about the myth that samurai culture was unchanging and timeless, stretching back thousands of years in the exact same form. This is completely wrong. Samurai culture evolved dramatically over the centuries. Early samurai were very different from late-period samurai. The weapons changed, the armor changed, the social role changed, the values changed. Early samurai were more like mounted archers fighting in loose formations. By the later periods, they were much more focused on swordsmanship and individual combat. When guns were introduced to Japan in the 1500s, samurai adapted and used them extensively. The image of the samurai that most people have in their heads is usually from the Edo period or later, but that's just one snapshot of a culture that existed for hundreds of years and changed constantly. So here's what this all comes down to. The samurai that Hollywood shows us aren't real. They're a mixture of different time periods, exaggerated values, and romantic ideals that were sometimes created centuries after the actual samurai era ended. The real samurai were more interesting, more complex and more human than the movies give them credit for. They weren't perfect honor-bound warriors who never broke the rules. They were people living in a complicated society, making difficult choices, and trying to survive in a world that was often brutal and unfair. Some of them lived up to high ideals, and some of them didn't. Some of them were heroes, and some of them were just regular people doing their jobs. And that's okay. That doesn't make their history less interesting, it actually makes it more interesting because it's real. The myths that Hollywood created have given us these narrow, simplified versions of samurai culture that don't capture the full picture. And when we only know the myths, we miss out on understanding what feudal Japan was actually like, what these warriors actually valued, and how their society actually functioned. Look, I'm not saying you can't enjoy samurai movies anymore. They're entertaining, and there's nothing wrong with fiction. But it's important to know what's fiction and what's history. The next time you watch a samurai film, maybe you'll notice these myths playing out on screen. Maybe you'll wonder what the real story behind that scene might have been. The real history of the samurai is full of contradictions, complexity, and humanity. It's messier than the movies, but it's also richer and more fascinating. These were real people who lived in a specific time and place, dealing with real problems and making real choices. They weren't mythical heroes from a storybook. They were humans with all the good and bad that comes with that. And honestly, I think that's a lot more compelling than any Hollywood myth could ever be. If you want more videos breaking down historical myths, hit that subscribe button.